What if, in the archives of New Orleans, a birth certificate revealed a child with two identical fathers, their signatures perfectly alike? What if the name belonged to an old French family whispered about in connection with forbidden experiments and occult rites? New Orleans had always carried a scent of mingling worlds. The damp breath of the Mississippi, the spices drifting through the French Quarter, and the dust of old paper that held centuries of history. Among the narrow streets with their wrought iron balconies stood the Orleans Parish Courthouse, a stern gray block with tall windows that cast shadows even on bright days. On that March morning in 1928, Clerk Jean Maurice, a 27-year-old native of Baton Rouge, son of a schoolteacher, was assigned to sort through boxes of aging documents. He was sent into the courthouse basement, where wooden shelves sagged under the weight of acts, protocols, and yellowed certificates. The room smelled of ink, dust, and dampness, the scent familiar to anyone who worked among the dead weight of paper. Jean had always been drawn to history. The very fabric of the city fascinated him. Louisiana, once a French colony, then under Spain, back to France again, and only in 1803 sold to the United States. In the French Quarter one could still hear old dialects, see elderly women praying in Latin at Catholic churches, and Creole musicians giving birth to a new sound, jazz. As he turned the brittle covers of the files, his fingers stopped on one document that stood out even among the chaos of the archive. It was a birth certificate dated 1898. The paper had cracked, the ink had faded in places, but the most striking detail leapt out instantly. Under father, there were two identical names, Joseph Dufresne and Lucien Dufresne. The names stood side by side, underlined in the same near-calligraphic handwriting. Jean felt his throat tighten. He had seen oddities before, clerks' mistakes, careless errors in old records. But this did not look accidental. There was order, deliberation, as if someone had wanted both brothers to exist on one line, yet their signatures mirrored each other perfectly. On the line below stood the child's name, Etienne Dufresne, and next to it, in red ink as if added later, was a symbol of a clover pierced by a nail. Jean brushed his fingertip across it. The ink had long dried, but the color had not dulled. A draft played in the old shutters. Somewhere in the French Quarter, a piano jangled, its melody mingling with the horns of river steamboats. The city lived a double life, festive and foreboding at once. And Jean, bent over the document, felt he was touching that hidden side of New Orleans that never made the newspapers. He lifted his head and glanced at the rows of shelves, stacked with hundreds of such boxes. How many other mistakes did the city conceal? How many secrets lay buried in dust and ink? That evening he could not sleep. He kept seeing the two Dufresne brothers, whose name he recalled from a history class. A wealthy family of French settlers who owned plantations in St. Bernard Parish. Whispers followed them. They were said to practice things not fit for Catholics. And now their names had risen from the papers that had fallen by chance into his hands. Jean folded the document and set it aside in a separate file. He felt this was no mere archival curiosity. It was a thread leading somewhere deeper. As he extinguished the lamp and stepped out of the courthouse into the rain, it seemed to him that, in the darkness of the French Quarter, a pair of eyes glimmered, watching him. 5 days after the discovery, Jean Maurice found himself still haunted by the name that had stared at him from the crumbling paper. Dufresne. It was not a common surname, not in Baton Rouge where he had grown up, nor even in the restless streets of New Orleans. Yet in the French Quarter, where names carried echoes of Europe, the Dufresnes were once spoken of with both admiration and unease. The family's story stretched back to the 18th century, when Joseph-François Dufresne, a French merchant, settled in Louisiana during its colonial era. Unlike the small traders and planters who came seeking fortune, the Dufresnes brought with them not just money but connections, ties to Parisian intellectuals and rumored circles of occultists. In New Orleans, they purchased wide tracts of land in St. Bernard Parish, where sugar cane rose in endless green rows, shimmering under the brutal sun. But the Dufresnes were different from other planters. Where neighbors invested in crops and machinery, the Dufresnes built a great library, imported crates of European books, and invited tutors from France. Their manner, a sprawling white house with wrought iron balconies and shaded galleries, was said to contain hidden rooms. Servants whispered of chambers with mirrored walls, candles burned at all hours, and symbols drawn on floors in chalk. By the late 1800s, the family line was represented by two brothers, Joseph Dufresne and Lucien Dufresne. They were born scarcely a year apart, though to look upon them was to see reflections in a single glass. Their height, the narrow lines of their jaws, even the streaks of silver that appeared early in their hair. It was as though the two men had been sculpted from the same mold. Newspapers of the time occasionally noted their appearances at galas or charity events, always side by side, often dressed alike. The public image was respectable, even charming. Benefactors of the church, supporters of the arts, patrons of French musicians. But beneath the polished exterior lay whispers. Parishioners at St. Louis Cathedral murmured of late-night carriages arriving at the Dufresne estate. Creole farmers told stories of lights flickering in the manor's glass-roofed conservatory, long after midnight. And in the city's taverns, sailors swore that they had seen the brothers walking the levee at dawn, murmuring prayers or curses, in a tongue older than French. The birth certificate Jean had uncovered now gnawed at him. Joseph and Lucien, both listed as the father of a child, Etienne. Could such a thing be explained by clerical error? He doubted it. No ordinary clerk would copy the same signature twice with such precision. The ink curves had the eerie perfection of intent, not accident. Digging deeper into the archives, Jean unearthed a newspaper clipping from the Times-Picayune, dated 1901. It featured a photograph of the Dufresne brothers at a civic banquet. The image, grainy but clear, showed them standing shoulder to shoulder. Their faces, so alike, seemed almost unnatural in the black and white still. And yet, as Jean studied the photo under lamplight, he thought he detected a subtle difference in their eyes. Joseph's gaze sharp, penetrating, while Lucien's appeared vacant, glassy, as though staring beyond the photographer. A marginal note scrawled in pencil on the back of the clipping read, "Reflections cannot be trusted." There was no signature. The more Jean read, the heavier the air of his study became. He sat by the open window of his rented room in the French Quarter, where the humid air carried strains of jazz from Basin Street. Shadows of wrought iron balconies stretched across cobblestones. The city felt alive with secrets, and the Dufresnes seemed to stand at the center of them all. Who was the child Etienne? Why was his lineage tied to two fathers who looked like mirrors? That night, as Jean closed the folder of clippings and letters, he noticed a thin trail of soot along the edge of one envelope, as though the paper had once been close to fire. He lifted it carefully, his heart quickening. Inside lay only a fragment, torn, incomplete. It bore a date, March 5, 1902, and beneath it, in faint ink, the beginning of a phrase, "The vow of..." The rest of the line had been consumed by flame. Jean set the fragment down, his fingers trembling. He did not yet understand, but he felt certain of one thing. The Dufresne family carried within their name a burden that was not meant to be spoken aloud. The week after Jean uncovered the fragment of burned paper, he could no longer pass the evenings without sensing the Dufresne name pressing in upon him. In the cafés of Chartres Street and the narrow corridors of the courthouse, he began asking subtle questions. Most shrugged, some changed the subject, but a few offered him hushed stories, like offerings reluctantly laid upon an altar. The Dufresne estate, they said, had once stood proud along the edge of St. Bernard Parish, surrounded by cane fields and moss-draped oaks. But what lingered in memory were not its columns or verandas, but the lights that flickered at night. Locals swore they had seen lanterns weaving through the glass conservatory, long after midnight. Others claimed to hear the sound of chanting, too rhythmic and solemn to be drunken songs. Jean dug further into the archives. Among parish records, he found depositions from a farmhand named Louis Moret, dated 1902. The handwriting was rough, the grammar poor, but the essence was chilling. They gather after sundown, always two leading, the rest following. Men and women both, from the family and from outside. They bring tokens, coins, hair, even bones of animals. I seen them walking toward the oak grove near the levee. I heard words I cannot write. Latin, I think. And fire, always fire. Louis Moret's testimony was buried beneath property disputes and never followed by legal action. Yet it stood there like a black nail driven into official parchment. Jean felt the air of the city itself turn heavier the more he read. New Orleans in 1928 was alive with sound. Jazz spilling from smoky bars, streetcars clanging their bells, Creole vendors crying out in French patois. But at night, when the Mississippi fog rolled inland and the gas lamps flickered, it seemed a different city entirely. A city of shadows, processions, and secret vows. Walking one evening past St. Louis Cathedral, Jean overheard two elderly women murmuring in French. They spoke of the soirées d'ombres, gatherings of shadows, when the Dufresnes hosted visitors who did not belong to the quarter, strangers in black coats, pale and silent, who arrived by carriage and left before dawn. One woman made the sign of the cross and whispered, "They pay their debts in ways we cannot name." Jean recorded it all in his notebook, though each line left him more unsettled. The signature on Etienne's birth certificate, the clover symbol pierced by a nail, the fragment of paper that had spoken of the vow. All of it pointed not only to ritual, but to inheritance, something passed through generations as deliberately as land or title. One night, Jean lingered along the levee where the Mississippi lapped against stone. The fog was thick, rolling like smoke, and in it he thought he saw figures. Two tall shapes walking together, their steps slow and even. They did not notice him or pretended not to, but when they passed beneath a gas lamp, Jean's blood chilled. The two were dressed identically, their faces hidden in shadow, yet their posture mirrored one another like reflections in glass. The next day, unable to contain his unease, Jean sought records in the Archdiocesan archives. There he found a letter from Reverend Claude Boudreau, dated May 1902, addressed to a fellow priest. The Dufresnes speak of a cleansing fire, of debts owed to heaven and earth alike. They claim their fortune rests upon promises not made to God, but to something older. I beg you, if you value your soul, do not press them further. What they summon in their gatherings is not for the faithful to behold. The letter ended abruptly, with a smeared ink blot across the page. That night, as Jean copied the text by lamplight in his rented room, the window rattled though no wind stirred. He closed the shutters quickly, his pulse racing. It was then, for the first time, that he allowed the thought to form fully in his mind. The child Etienne had been born not of two men by accident, but by design. And if design, then by what vow? On the desk before him lay the torn fragment, its last visible words glowing in the lamplight. The vow of... Jean pressed the paper flat, staring at it until his vision blurred. Outside, a church bell tolled midnight, but in the silence that followed he could have sworn he heard another sound. Low, rhythmic, like a distant chant carried on the fog. By mid-March, Jean Morris's nights had become restless. The clatter of streetcars on Canal Street, once comforting, now sounded like a procession of iron wheels grinding toward some invisible ritual. He began spending more time in the courthouse basement, pulling not just legal records but discarded correspondence, private journals, and charred scraps others had deemed irrelevant. It was there, beneath a stack of property deeds from 1903, that Jean uncovered a leather-bound volume, its cover warped by damp. Inside, the handwriting was elegant yet fevered, as though the pen had been driven by both precision and dread. The first page bore a name: Dr. Alphonse Duval, a physician known in whispers around St. Bernard Parish for his philosophical interests. The journal read not as a medical text but as a confession. Duval described evenings spent at the Dufresne estate, where the brothers conducted what he called the experiment of the doubled shadow. A man must stand between two mirrors, Duval wrote. While words older than scripture are spoken, the mirrors must be aligned so that the reflection appears endless. And in the silence between breaths, the vow is spoken, not to God, but to the hollow. Jean's pulse quickened as he traced the passages. They spoke of candles arranged in threes, of silver pins driven into wax figures, of a child placed in the center of a mirrored room. And then, chillingly, The boy Etienne carries two lineages, two reflections united in one body. He is not an accident but a vessel, born to keep the inheritance unbroken. When the time comes, he shall not die. Jean closed the journal, his hands trembling. The city outside seemed to mock him with its ordinary life, the laughter spilling from Bourbon Street, the smell of coffee and chicory drifting from corner cafes, the brass bands practicing in courtyards. Yet beneath it all, he sensed the thrum of something darker, like a drumbeat no one else acknowledged. He carried the journal back to his small room in the French Quarter, lighting a single lamp against the humid night. He read on. Duval's entries became more frenzied as they neared the year 1902. Joseph insists the child is his, Lucien the same, but neither speaks plainly. They are mirrors, reflections of one another, and through the right they both lay claim. The oath binds them, and through them binds the boy. I have seen the boy sleep with eyes half open, as though watching both this world and another. I fear him, yet I pity him, for he will inherit not land nor coin, but eternity. Jean shut the book, his chest tight. He stepped to the window, where the night air pressed heavy with the scent of river fog. Across the quarter, a jazz trumpet wailed, a lonely, bending note that seemed to echo the words he had just read. He will not die. Unable to bear the silence, Jean walked to the courthouse to confirm Duval's identity. Records showed that Dr. Alphonse Duval had indeed practiced medicine in St. Bernard Parish. But his name vanished after October 1902, the very month the Dufresne estate had burned. No burial record, no obituary, nothing. Jean felt a chill crawl along his spine. He returned to his room near midnight and opened the journal once more. The final entry was only half legible, the ink smeared by water or perhaps tears. Yet one line stood clear. The air shall walk with two shadows. When thunder rolls in clear skies, it will be the sign. Jean laid the book down and stared at the flame of his lamp. The wick sputtered, sending a thin curl of smoke into the stale air. And in that fragile silence, he thought he heard it again, that low, distant chant, like voices rising from the river fog, speaking words not meant for mortal ears. By the waning days of March, Jean Morris's obsession with the Dufresne papers had begun to consume him. He ate little, slept less, and when he did sleep, dreams of mirrored rooms and chanting voices woke him in sweat. It was during these restless nights that he uncovered the newspapers from March 1902. Their headlines brittle yet still black with urgency. Mysterious fire ravages Dufresne estate. The reports were sparse, almost deliberately so. Electrical fault, one claimed. Another blamed a lantern overturned by servants. But the photographs told a different story. They showed not the charred ruin of one wing, but the manor itself engulfed, its great conservatory a skeleton of iron and glass. The flames had reached so high that they lit the cane fields for miles, and riverboat captains swore they could see the glow from the Mississippi. Jean pressed closer to the photographs, studying the silhouettes in the foreground. Amid the smoke, a crowd had gathered, farmhands, neighbors, priests summoned from nearby parishes. Yet there, near the edge of the blaze, two figures stood too calmly. Tall, straight-backed, their faces lost in shadow, they did not move as the roof collapsed. They seemed to watch, not in grief, but in vigil. The articles reported the death of Lucien Dufresne. His body, they said, had been recovered from the eastern wing. But no description followed, no details of wounds, no certainty of identity. And curiously, no burial record accompanied the obituary. Jean, scouring parish registers, found only a blank where Lucien's name should have been. Among the debris catalogued after the fire, one item caught his breath. A child's cradle, carved from oak, scorched but not destroyed. On its side, faint but legible, was the symbol of the clover pierced by a nail. Jean imagined the scene. Servants rushing through the smoke, the crack of timber, the cries of neighbors. And amid it all, that cradle, marked with a sign that had no place in Christian homes. Who had lain in it? Etienne, the child of two fathers? Or another? Outside the courthouse window, the spring storm gathered. The air hung heavy, and thunder rumbled across the city, though the sky showed only distant clouds. New Orleans seemed to breathe in unison with the tale, humid, restless, on the brink of breaking. Jean sought more. He returned to the archives, demanding records of the fire. But much was missing, as though someone had culled the files. What remained were whispers buried in marginalia. A servant's testimony, never published, claiming she saw a black chest carried from the flames by Joseph. Another note, and signed, spoke of chanting heard even as the house collapsed. The city itself carried memory of that night. An old barkeep on Royal Street recalled that the sky turned red above St. Bernard Parish. Parishioners at St. Louis Cathedral remembered bells tolling long past midnight, though no hand touched the ropes. And in one drawer, almost overlooked, Jean found a fragment of cloth. Soot-stained linen with edges crisped by flame. Someone had wrapped it carefully, tied with twine, and marked with a date, March 20th, 1902. He untied it, and a small silver object clattered onto the table. A pin, twisted and blackened by heat, but still bearing the faint emblem of the clover and nail. Jean sat motionless, the hum of the courthouse dim around him. The journal of Dr. Duval had spoken of pins, driven into wax figures, used in ceremonies of reflection. And now, here was one, scarred by fire yet enduring. As he held it, the lamplight flickered. For an instant, the reflection in the window seemed not his own. He dropped the pin, heart racing. The fire of 1902 had not been an accident. It had been a rupture, whether of ritual gone wrong, or of vows too heavy for even the Dufresnes to bear. And yet, amid the ruins, a cradle had survived. Jean closed the files, his breath ragged. The echoes of the blaze seemed to roar still, though the flames had died 26 years ago. He could almost smell the smoke, hear the timbers crack. But louder still, in his mind, was a single line from Duval's journal. When thunder rolls in clear skies, it will be the sign. That night, lying awake, Jean heard it again. Thunder without storm. And for the first time, he wondered if the fire had truly claimed Lucien Dufresne. Or if, like the mirrored signatures on the birth certificate, death itself had been only a reflection. The storm passed, but Jean Maurice could not shake the echo of thunder without clouds. It followed him into the courthouse corridors, into the hollow silence of the archive vaults. Each drawer he opened seemed to breathe dust into the air like whispers, each ledger heavier than the last. Yet what he discovered on March 22nd would alter the course of his obsession entirely. In a file mislabeled, Births, 1903, Jean found another certificate bearing the name Etienne Dufresne. He froze. The paper was of the same age as the first, its ink browned, its edges brittle. But this one was dated a year later, 1899, not 1898. The mother's name was the same. The father's line once again bore two signatures, Joseph and Lucien. Their pen strokes identical. 2 records, 2 years, the same child. No clerical error could explain it. No registrar would replicate such a duplication without reason, or without command. Jean compared the documents under lamplight. Each was stamped with the official seal of Orleans Parish, though the wax differed, one a faded crimson, the other a deeper, glossier red. More chilling still, each bore in its margin the faint mark of the clover pierced by a nail, inked in the same shade of dried red. He brought the discovery to his superior, a portly man named Clement Roux, who had overseen the archives for decades. Roux skimmed the documents, his face paling. Without a word, he set them aside, locked the drawer, and told Jean, "These are not for you, not for anyone." His voice, usually gruff, trembled as he added, "Leave them where they lie." But Jean could not. That evening, long after the courthouse emptied, he returned. His footsteps echoed against stone floors, lantern light trembling in the still air. He retrieved the certificates, slipping them into his satchel, and as he did, something else caught his eye. A small sealed envelope, wedged behind the drawer lining. It was marked in ornate script, "Ne pas ouvrir avant 1928. Do not open until 1928. His pulse surged. With shaking hands, he slit the wax. Inside lay a folded sheet, its ink faded but legible. If you read this, then the vow has crossed the threshold of time. The heir will not be bound to 1 year, nor to one record. He exists in reflection, in doubling. He will stand when others fall, for he belongs to both and neither. Guard yourself, for to trace his lineage is to summon his gaze. There was no signature, only the familiar symbols scrawled at the bottom, the clover and nail. Jean sat motionless in the dim archive chamber, the silence pressing on him like stone. Through the open transom window, the sounds of the French Quarter drifted faintly. Distant horns, laughter from taverns, the rattle of a carriage. But in that silence, he felt eyes upon him. When he left, the rain had stopped, but puddles still glistened on the cobblestones. The lamps burned low, their light smearing across the wet stones like spilled gold. He clutched the satchel close, every step echoing too loud in the empty street. At the threshold of his boarding house, he thought he heard footsteps behind him, measured, deliberate. He turned, but the street was empty, save for the fog creeping from the river. That night, he laid the certificates side by side on his desk. Etienne's name stared back at him twice, like twin reflections in glass. And beside them, the envelope's warning burned in his mind. To trace his lineage is to summon his gaze. Jean blew out the lamp, but long after darkness swallowed the room, he could not sleep. For in his dreams, the reflection in his mirror did not close its eyes when he did. By March 24th, the whispers had begun to reach Jean before he sought them. In taverns off Royal Street, on benches along Jackson Square, even from old women selling pralines near the cathedral, the same hushed tale stirred the air. The Dufresne boy walked still. Jean had thought of Etienne Dufresne as a figure locked in brittle paper and fading ink. Yet the city seemed determined to drag him into the present. Neighbors claimed to see him at night, a man of 30 with a pale face, walking beneath wrought iron balconies. Some swore he lingered near St. Louis Cemetery No. 1, where shadows pooled deeper between the above-ground tombs. Others whispered that he had been seen on the levee, staring at the Mississippi as if waiting for the river to speak. At first, Jean dismissed these stories as the drunken inventions of a superstitious town. But then he began to notice the pattern. The witnesses did not describe a ghost in tatters or a specter wailing for peace. They described a man alive, flesh and blood, though curiously unchanged from the photographs dated 3 decades earlier. His hair remained dark, his figure lean. Only his eyes, they said, betrayed him. Eyes too reflective, like twin mirrors catching light where none should be. Jean's own nights grew heavier. He carried the satchel of documents with him wherever he went, though the weight seemed to press more on his chest than his shoulder. When he walked the quarter, he felt eyes on him, and once, as he passed an alley off Chartres Street, he saw a figure retreat into shadow. A man whose gait mirrored his own stride exactly, step for step. Seeking answers, Jean approached an antiquarian named Madeleine Chastain, who ran a dusty shop filled with maps, books, and relics of the French colonial past. She was a woman in her 60s, her hair bound in a silver braid, her accent tinged with the Cajun French of the bayous. When Jean placed the 2 birth certificates on her desk, she grew still. "Dufresne," she whispered, tracing the ink. "You know what that name means in St. Bernard Parish, do you not?" Jean shook his head. They were landowners, yes, but they were also seekers of immortality, of forbidden rites brought from Europe. Some say they came from Brittany, where such symbols were carved into stones older than the cathedrals. The clover pierced by a nail. She crossed herself. It is no blessing. It is a binding. Jean told her of the journal, of Dr. Duval's words, of the fire. Madeleine listened, her lined face unreadable, until finally she said, "If the boy lives, it is not because he was spared. It is because he was claimed. To bind a life outside time is to steal from death itself. And death will always seek repayment." That night, as Jean returned to his boarding room, the quarter seemed less alive and more watchful. The laughter of revelers rang hollow. The jazz drifting from dim bars throbbed like a pulse beneath the cobblestones. He placed the certificates back in his drawer, but when he shut it, the sound echoed unnaturally long, as though another drawer had closed in perfect synchrony somewhere else. He froze, listening. Silence. Lying in bed, Jean stared at the cracked ceiling. He thought of the eyewitnesses, of Madeline's words, of the line in Duval's journal. The heir shall walk with two shadows. And as he drifted into uneasy half-sleep, he swore he felt movement at the edge of the room. A second shadow leaning against the wall. Watching. Waiting. By the last week of March, the French Quarter had changed its face for Jean Maurice. What once appeared a vibrant maze of music, markets, and mingling tongues now seemed a stage where shadows played the greater part. He found himself pausing at corners, staring up at wrought iron balconies where gas lamps glowed like watchful eyes. The laughter of streetcar conductors, the rolling calls of fishmongers at the riverfront, all seemed muted, muffled, as if the city itself listened to something else beneath its own noise. It was on the morning of March 26th that Jean encountered the silent witness. He had gone to the public market on Decatur Street, seeking distraction among barrels of oysters and sacks of coffee beans, their smells sharp in the humid air. Amid the bustle, he noticed an elderly black man sitting on a crate near the river gate, staring with a gaze too fixed for a casual bystander. His clothes were clean but worn, a frayed vest, trousers patched at the knees. His hands trembled slightly as he polished the handle of a cane. When Jean drew near, the man lifted his eyes, and in them Jean saw a depth of recognition. The man spoke softly, his voice a cracked murmur, yet steady. "You're chasing ghosts you don't understand." Jean froze. "What do you mean?" The man leaned forward, his cane tapping the stones. "I saw him, long ago when the fire took the house. I was a boy then. We ran to the estate with buckets, but no water could quench it. And through the smoke, I saw a man carrying a child. The flames licked high, but neither burned. His face." The man's eyes clouded, and he shivered. "It was a face I saw again, 20 years later, walking these very streets unchanged." Jean's pulse hammered. "The child?" "The child had two shadows," the man whispered, pressing his fingers into the cane as if the memory still scorched him. "One fell on the ground. The other did not." Silence hung between them, broken only by the caw of gulls circling above the levee. The man finally exhaled, as though unburdened. "They call him by many names now, but some of us call him El Harityer Ubli, the Forgotten Heir. He is not dead nor living as we are. He waits, always waits." Jean wanted to ask more, but when he blinked, the man's attention had drifted back to the river. His lips moved silently, as though in prayer. Realizing no more words would come, Jean left, though the witness's trembling voice echoed in his chest. That evening, Jean returned to his room and laid out the two certificates, the journal of Dr. Duval and the charred silver pin. The relics formed a grim constellation across the desk. Etienne's name repeated, the warning of two shadows, the fire, the missing body of Lucien, the whispered survival. He thought again of the man at the market. Could it be true? Could someone carry the same face across decades, unwrinkled, unbent? Jean pressed his palms against his eyes until he saw sparks. Yet the doubt remained. Outside, the quarter pulsed with music. Brass horns flared, drums thundered, and young people danced in the streets. But under that joyous clamor, Jean felt the slower beat of something older, like the echo of a hidden drum circle beneath the cobblestones. Unable to rest, he walked to St. Louis Cemetery No. 1, its gates closed for the night. He stood at the iron bars, staring into the moonlit maze of above-ground tombs. A breeze stirred, carrying the scent of moss and old stone. In the shadows, he thought he saw movement, a figure gliding silently between crypts. When thunder rumbled in the clear sky, Jean turned and fled. Back in his room, gasping, he clutched the certificates to his chest as though they were both curse and salvation. And he remembered the silent witness's words. The child had two shadows. By the last days of March, Jean Maurice no longer recognized the face that stared back at him in shop windows. His cheeks had hollowed, his eyes rimmed in sleepless shadow. He walked the corridor like a man marked, clutching his satchel as though it contained his very breath. And perhaps it did, for inside lay the proof that Etienne Dufresne was not confined to history but walking still. That morning, a letter awaited him in the courthouse mailroom. No address, no stamp. Only his name, Jean Maurice. The envelope smelled faintly of smoke. Inside was a single slip of paper, its ink slanted and precise. If you seek truth, come to the Dufresne estate. Midnight. Bring nothing but yourself. Jean's pulse stuttered. The estate had been in ruins since the fire of 1902. Its charred skeleton left to rot in the cane fields of St. Bernard Parish. To enter it was trespass, and yet he knew he would go. That night, he took the streetcar to the edge of the city and walked the final miles by lantern light. The fields stretched dark and endless, the air thick with the smell of damp earth and cane stubble. At last, he saw it. The husk of the Dufresne house, its stone walls scorched black, iron beams jutting like ribs against the starless sky. Inside, silence reigned. The once grand hall was a hollow cavern of soot. The moonlight through broken arches cast pale beams across the floor. And there, propped against the far wall, stood a mirror taller than a man, its gilt frame tarnished but intact. Its surface gleamed too brightly for the ruin around it, as if untouched by fire or time. Jean approached, lantern trembling in his hand. His reflection met him, but it was wrong. The man in the glass was not gaunt and weary but strong, youthful, unmarked by sleepless nights. The face was his own, and yet not his own, lit by eyes too sharp, too knowing. Then the reflection smiled. Jean had not. His breath caught. The mirror darkened, the lantern flame dimming though its wick still burned. Shadows gathered behind the glass, coiling like smoke, until a second figure emerged beside his double. A man with the same face but dressed in 19th century finery, hair slicked back, eyes twin mirrors. Etienne. Jean stumbled backward. The mirror shuddered, and the sound was like thunder in a clear sky. Etienne raised a hand and pressed it to the glass, and Jean felt cold bloom in his chest as though an unseen hand mirrored the gesture on his ribs. A voice filled the hall, not spoken aloud but resonating in his skull. One heir must be forgotten so the other may endure. Jean's knees weakened. The silent witness's words, Madeline's warnings, Duval's journal, all converged into this moment. The Dufresne heir was not a man but a reflection given flesh, sustained by vows older than the city itself. The glass rippled. For a heartbeat, Jean saw not himself but two figures, Joseph and Lucien, standing shoulder to shoulder, their mirrored signatures binding him in place. Behind them, the child Etienne lay in the cradle marked with the clover and nail. Jean screamed, but the sound was swallowed by the ruins. The mirror flashed white, and when his vision cleared, he was alone. The lantern lay shattered at his feet, its oil spilling across the floorboards. Yet the glass still stood, gleaming, empty, or nearly empty. For as Jean staggered closer, he saw the truth. The reflection no longer matched him. It lingered half a beat too long, blinking when he did not. And in its eyes, a second shadow flickered. Outside, thunder rolled across the fields, though the night sky was calm and starry. And on the cracked stone threshold of the Dufresne estate, someone, perhaps him, perhaps another, had placed a fresh sprig of yew. In the weeks that followed, Jean Maurice vanished from the courthouse records. His name appeared once more, briefly, in a resignation notice filed by a colleague, then faded like ink left in the rain. Some said he had taken ill and left the city. Others whispered he had been claimed by the very documents he pursued. Yet, in the French Quarter, stories began to shift. Witnesses no longer spoke of a pale man alone, but of two figures always walking side by side in the fog. One gaunt, weary, clutching papers to his chest. The other ageless, eyes gleaming like mirrors. At St. Louis Cemetery, guides today still warn tourists to tread lightly near a certain row of crypts. On quiet afternoons, when thunder rolls across a cloudless sky, they say you may glimpse a sprig of fresh yew upon the stones, though no living hand has placed it there. And so the legend of the Forgotten Heir endures. Not as a ghost, not as a man, but as a reflection. One that waits for those who dare to look too long into the glass.